Greetings and salutations. This is Abdelhadi with The Bitter Truth, where we may not have all the answers, but we're going to ask an awful lot of questions. You can also become a bitter pill or a spoonful of sugar by visiting patreon.com/The Bitter Truth, and you can get some fabulous swag to make your life better. Today, I'm excited. I have a very esteemed guest. Actually has done a lot of writing and a lot of study. His name is Shaul Magid, and he is a professor of Jewish studies at Dartmouth College. He's also a senior research fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America. His last two books are Piety and Rebellion, Essays in Hasidism, and the Bible and the Talmud and the New Testament. He's also a contributing editor to Tablet Magazine. We're going to talk about an article that fairly recently, but it's kind of the point of our talk today, conversation. He's also a editor of the Jewish Thought and Culture at Tikkun Magazine. And Shaul, how are you doing?
Hey, I'm great. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Hey, appreciate you coming on, man. So let's get into it a little bit. Your article has been a couple of months out, and I'm sure you've gotten a lot of traction off of it because it's a pretty controversial topic as far as the state of Israel alongside of a possible Palestinian state, or as you and I both know, the two-state solution is kind of not even a myth at this point.
Right.
What kind of reception have you gotten from the article?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, the article is really it's based on a book by a political science professor named Ian Lustig from the University of Pennsylvania, and he's been writing for a long time about the two-state solution and the way in which from his point of view, not only is it really no longer possible, but it never really was viable. It really was, as you say, a kind of myth that. In certain ways, there are kind of two camps here. In Israel, it kept Israel kind of aligned with its allies, and it kept American Jews, and particularly, able to support Israel. American Jews who are basically liberally minded, very, very focused on democracy, to say, well, this occupation is a temporary thing, and eventually there'll be a resolution. There'll be two states, a Palestinian state, a Jewish state living side by side. But the reality is that it's not clear how viable that ever was. And I think one of the things that, as you said in the beginning of your remarks, certainly today, when we're standing right on the cusp, we're now at the beginning of June and the beginning of July, the process of annexing sections of the West Bank is set to begin by the Israeli government, and the inhabitants of that territory that will be annexed, the Palestinians that are living in that territory that will be annexed, will not be getting Israeli citizenship, which really, in a certain sense, changes the game. It's really a game changer in a lot of ways, if it actually happens. It's not totally clear it's going to happen, but right now it seems that's where we're heading.
Well, I mean, and this is the thing, and I love the point you make in your piece, because I'm from LA, and I've got a lot of American Jewish friends and a lot of Israeli liberal friends, being born and raised in LA, and they seem to believe that, and I don't think they're necessarily lying to themselves or wanting to be deceitful. They just think that there is a possibility of a two-state solution. But really, there is just one state, and that is the state of Israel. That's what's recognized. And the only way I can see, and I don't think this is a popular idea, but the only way I can see is an absolute right of return of Palestinians and allowing them to, buy land and have lives there and equal rights. To declare yourself the Jewish state is antithetical to democracy. Am I wrong about that, or is that?
Well, that's a very good question. In the original Declaration of Independence, it did not have the language of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. That was added later on, in the 1880s. And since the Jewish and democratic state was added into the Israeli Statement of Independence, it's really been debated, and in Israel and beyond, whether actually that is itself a possibility. What would that actually mean? I mean, how do you have a truly democratic state that requires by law that one ethnic group would be the majority? I mean, that's not what we call democracy in America, because in America we have a liberal democracy. Now, right. There are other kinds of democracies that have been called ethnic democracies. Switzerland, Germany, to some extent, certainly Japan, where one ethnic group is given priority over other ethnic groups. But in the case of Israel, I think if if you want to look at a case of Israel, let's say juxtaposed to Japan, because if you're not an ethnic Japanese, there is no way you can ever become a citizen of Japan.
Right.
That's
right.
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 The difference between the Israeli situation and the Japanese situation is there's such a small amount of non-ethnic Japanese who live in Japan that it's really not an issue. But in Israel, you have a case where you have about 22%, almost 23% of the population are not Jews. They're Arab, Muslims, or Christians. So you have a large minority of people who are not ethnically Jewish. And so then to basically deny them, in a certain sense, the rights of the majority, of the rights that any group would have in a liberal democracy, really asks the question whether Jewish and democratic can actually ever work.
Well, and then unlike the Japanese, because the Japanese don't purposefully oppress anyone that's living in Japan, whereas in Israel, the 22% that you're talking about, they're Palestinian citizens of Israel. They are citizens of Israel, but we're not even getting into Gaza and the West Bank yet. Right. But even those citizens enjoy diminished rights and access. I'm not even talking about West Bank and Gaza. I'm talking about citizens in Israel. They have a separate ID. They've got several designations of two different IDs, a green one and a blue one. So it seems like it just keeps becoming this acquisition of culture by force, and they seem to be always surprised that the Palestinian Arabs don't want to play ball by this.
Well, it's a good point to make, especially to your listeners. There are really two issues going on. The one issue is the occupation, which is the more than 1 million Palestinians, certainly in the West Bank, and not even including Gaza, who are basically stateless. Right? They're not citizens of any country. They're under military occupation, and then you have what used to be called Israeli Arabs, but now that community is more and more identifying as Israeli Palestinians or Palestinian Israelis, who are full citizens of the state of Israel. They vote in national elections. They can be on the Israeli Supreme Court. They're professors in universities and so on and so forth. They pay taxes. They don't serve in the army, not because they're legally exempt from serving in the army, but because the army doesn't call them into service for the most part. And they have a status that is, as you say, a discriminatory status, but it's much more subtle than the stateless status of the Palestinians. So there is certainly an issue of discrimination of the non-Jewish residents of the state of Israel, but that's a separate issue. And there are many people in Israel that are working on that, and there are many ways in which groups of Palestinian Arabs or Israeli Palestinians, or however they identify, and Jewish Israelis are trying to work together to make the system more equal than it is. But then you have the stateless Palestinians who are living in the West Bank, which is a whole different story.
Right. Now, well, and then let me back up a second. When you say stateless Palestinians, talking about the West Bank, you're also talking about those in Gaza, correct?
About Gaza too.
Right. Okay. See, but then just to kind of get some clarity, you mentioned a second ago the different rights that the Palestinians do have in Israel, the citizens have in Israel. And I'm not saying that you're necessarily being disingenuous. I mean, you're in America, so we don't live there. But I mean, as far as, like, for example, being eligible for the Supreme Court, in the entire history of the country, there's only been one Palestinian on the Supreme Court for 9 months as an interim guy. So it's not like, it's not like Bibi's going to go appointing Palestinian judges on the Supreme Court.
Yeah, right. You're right. You're totally right. I mean, the discrimination is systemic. I mean, one of the interesting things about the country is that now in the last two elections, as some of your listeners probably know, Israel has had 3 elections in the last year because they can't seem to vote in a party that can make a coalition. But the third largest party in the country is the Arab list. So that for the first time really in the history of the country, Arabs in Israel have more political power than they have ever had. Now, they have never been part of a ruling coalition.
Right.
And they won't, and they're not a part of this ruling coalition either, for a variety of reasons. I think that there are many in the Arab list constituency that don't want to be a part of the ruling coalition. And also, I think that the ruling party knows that if the Arabs would be part of the ruling coalition, there would be many Jewish Israelis who would consider that to be an illegitimate government. So it's a kind of a complicated story that goes both ways. But Ayman Oda, who's the head of the Arab list, is really one of the most prominent Israeli politicians working today. I mean, he basically was one of the organizers of this march that they just had against annexation in Rabin Square in Tel Aviv last week. So I think there's a shifting sands going on vis-a-vis the Israeli Arabs in terms of their political power and their participation in the process. But as you say, systemic discrimination continues.
Well, let me ask you a question, because the point of your article, and it was a good one, and when we spoke a few weeks back, talking about getting on the show, the myth of the two-state solution. What is this attachment that I guess what I'm asking is, why can't the so-called liberal Israeli or the liberal American Jew just accept the fact that your Zionism has nothing to do with a Palestinian right of return? If you are a democracy and God's protecting you, or whatever the hell you want to believe, I'm not religious. I don't have a dog in this fight. So, right. But why can't you just accept that? Because I don't want to screw over 8 or 9 generations of Israelis either. Now, they've been there, they bought land or whatever, but why can't we simply have Palestinians have a right of return, give them equal rights? I mean, Iran is a theocracy, and it's the second largest Jewish population outside of Israel, right. And Jews there have rights, and they've never been persecuted or boiled in oil or whatever. I mean, I'd be more afraid of being a Jew in Saudi Arabia than I would be a Jew in Iran.
Well, it's the second largest Jewish population in the Middle East outside of Israel. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Right.
Right. I think you're right. No, I think you raise a good question. I think for a lot of American Jews and a lot of liberal Israelis, they are very attached to two things that seem to be standing now in contradiction. They're very attached to a liberal democracy. They're very attached to the notion of democracy. And on the other hand, they're very attached to the notion of a Jewish state. And again, as we said earlier, whether these things are incommensurate, the democracy and the notion of a Jewish state, I think remains very much the tension. So sure. On the one hand, you'd say, all right, if you have an open, right of return of Palestinians, you're talking about potentially, given how many generations you want to count, potentially you have a number of 1 million, more than 2 million, 3 million people who can claim Palestinian ancestry from before 1948 that could make that claim. Now, the truth is that Khalil Shakaki, who's the most well-respected pollster in Palestine, in Nablus, in his polling, he argues that, let's say there would be a full open right of return, right? That any person that can claim Palestinian ancestry from 1948 can come back to live in the state of Israel. His argument is that very few Palestinians would actually do that. In other words, Palestinians who have been living in the Gulf states, Palestinians who have been living in Europe, Palestinians who have been living in the United States, Palestinians living in Australia, North America, they've been living there for generations, that they're going to pick themselves up, many of whom live middle-class lives, and move back to Palestine or move back to Israel. He said the polling really doesn't bear that out. So it may be a little bit of a paper tiger, and there have been some discussions, for example, of some kind of right of return that would be symbolic. Let's say 10,000, 50,000 Palestinians who would be able to return as part of a comprehensive deal between the Palestinians and the Israelis. But again, there's no peace process anymore. And there's no one sitting at the table. There's no table anymore. No. And there's no even pretense of a peace process.
No. Well, and honestly, there never has been one. I mean, in the interest of transparency, and I think you and I talked about this. My father's Palestinian, and I'm first generation here, and I was there in '88 for the first Intifada. Good times. Great way to spend a vacation. So anyway, but
I will say there was the one time, ironically, was really in 1979 with the first Camp David Accord with Jimmy Carter, Anwar Sadat, and Menachem Begin. And when Sadat made that symbolic trip to Jerusalem, that was really an incredible moment for Israelis to believe that the possibility of normalization existed. Now, obviously, Camp David 1 was not between the Palestinians and the Israelis, it was between Egypt and Israel. It was very different.
But see, then also too, you sold Sadat sold the Palestinians down the river, because here's the largest Arab nation making a deal without putting Palestine on the table, when it's like doing Hamlet without Hamlet.
Right.
And that's the challenge that we've had the whole entire 70-odd year process of this. I mean, even further back, you go to Israeli in the 1870s, it was always about, displacing a group of people.
Yeah.
And so the challenge, the big challenge I have with a lot of this is, like, for example, my cousin was back there about a year and a half ago, and to see his mother, and he was there. He was there pushing 90 days. Past 90 days, he's going to get in trouble trying to get out of, trying to get back to Amman if he was going to fly out of Amman, or try to get out of the airport in Tel Aviv,
Right.
which were his options. And so again, that's not treating anybody quote unquote equally. Right. And then trying to appropriate the culture. This is the thing. This is the problem I have with the idea of a two-state solution and the insistence on it, especially from anyone, Israeli, American, Jew. They've seen the map lately. There's not even a border. It's like a couple of little chicken pox of what used to be the border of the West Bank. It's not 1967 anymore.
Right.
And so, to your point, it would probably largely be symbolic, but not symbolic to, say, for example, people in the West Bank who wouldn't even have to move. They would just have to live there, but they would be declared citizens of Israel with the same exact rights, and then just open up Gaza and let people come back to work and not do these draconian calorie counts and routine, mowing the lawn, carpet bombing, Benny Gantz style, killing several thousand people at a time. This is the thing. This is a question I guess I want to throw at you really fast. How does the liberal Zionist, it's almost an oxymoron, but how does the liberal Zionist reconcile occupation that's in violation of international law? As soon as something goes there the way they don't like it, it's international law. But they're violating international law on the regular. How do they reconcile that? That's a big deal.
I think that's a very good question, and I think the community of Jews that's really, in a certain sense, in a state of high anxiety now are the liberal Zionists, because the settler Zionists, they're fine with what's going on, right?
Sure.
They love the status quo because the status quo let them continue to build settlements, put facts on the ground, and create a reality where a two-state solution is impossible. So, in fact, it was Israeli government inaction and settler activity that allowed the situation to happen, to exist, that even if there was the will for a two-state solution at this point, there may not be, the territory may no longer exist. And this is separating the problem of Gaza and the West Bank and how to create some kind of theory. So I think that the liberal Zionist is really, in a sense, stuck. They were able to continue to remain liberal Zionists because of the notion of the occupation as, yes, illegal, but also something that was going to be temporary and would eventually end and result in the solution that they felt was the only viable solution, which is two states. So for liberal Zionists, once you acknowledge the death of the two-state solution, they have no other alternative, because they're not going to be in favor of a liberal democracy that would actually undermine the notion of a Jewish state. And they're not going to be in favor of a one-state apartheid, which is really what would happen with annexation. So in a certain sense, with the debt, that's why I started my essay with that anecdote about asking an American Jewish leader, what would you do if the two-state solution was really dead? And he said that would be the end of my Zionism, because there really is no alternative. So I think that people are hanging on to this notion of two states in a way that is in a certain sense life support for their own commitment to Zionism. The problem with that is that they serve the two states serves as cover for the settler Zionists who are saying, yeah, keep talking about two states, we'll keep building. In other words, they're kind of working off each other. And I think that's why maybe this annexation thing is just kind of throwing down the gauntlet, and it's really going to be a question of, are you in or are you out? Because once you annex, the occupation is over.
Well, and to make it to your point, because you make that point in the paper, that it's like running cover. As long as we keep talking about two-state solution, and the right wing, which is pretty much the entire government, keep saying, yeah, we're working on it. And in the meantime, nothing's happening. And then you keep, kicking people out of homes and apartments and throwing them out into the street and putting them, in ersatz camps in the West Bank and a full-on refugee camp in Gaza. Again, but see, this is the reality of it. This is something that, except for the United States, I don't know of a country or of a nationality on earth, of anyone I've ever talked to, that doesn't see really the writing on the wall. Even people with a cursory knowledge of the Palestinian-Israeli question. And to be candid, I want to thank you for coming on, because I can't even get Palestinians to come on this fucking show. So like they don't know enough. They don't want to talk about it. I'm like, they want to talk about climate change or whatever. I'm like, okay, that's awesome. Surely you have an opinion, Right. So, I mean, so far I've had an Israeli, an American Jew, a Spaniard, and a Mexican come talk about the Israeli-Palestinian question. I can't get a Palestinian to save my life. So I appreciate that as a little, just get that out of the way. But the reality of it, though, is I don't understand how people can be that disingenuous hanging on to this idea. The most liberal Zionist, which again is almost oxymoronic, they cannot accept that this is even productive.
Right. I think that what's happening is, and these last elections, I think, will be historically significant, because one of the things that comes out is that the Israeli right, which doesn't have enough for a coalition, but just shy of a coalition, is now partnering with the Israeli center, which is Benny Gantz, who really, on this question, is not that much different than the Israeli right.
No.
Yeah, so what you do is you have a diminishing Israeli left, the Meretz party, which is almost completely inconsequential at this point. I mean, it's no power whatsoever. So you're left with a very large coalition of people who basically have come to the conclusion that a two-state solution is not possible and is not even necessarily desirable. So again, I think you're in a situation where liberal Zionists are, in some sense, going to have to make a choice. Now, I will say the extremes on either side are supporting each other. So every time there's Palestinian violence, that really supports the settler program, right? Every time you have the settler program that's flexing its muscles, that supports the Palestinian violence. So basically what you're having in some strange way is that the two extremes are actually the people that are driving the bus.
Right. Well, and then in your article too, you reference Zeev Jabotinsky. Jabotinsky, yeah. I can't say his name. I can't speak today. And he talks about the Iron Wall, which is, I mean, even though he had problems with Ben Gurion, it seems like that was like the almost the template for the last 100 years.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think that Jabotinsky was an interesting character because on the one hand, he's the father of the Israeli right, certainly of the Likud party. But on the other hand, he really understood the need for coexistence, and he also understood the need for minority rights. Because, Jabotinsky, interestingly, was fighting on the one hand for minority rights of Jews in Russia, and also was basically arguing for minority rights of Arabs in Palestine. So he wanted a Jewish majority. He was certainly committed to a Jewish majority. But that Jewish majority, for the state to work, had to actually really give the Arab minority kind of full rights in ways that they never really had. So he becomes an interesting he's an interesting person both on the right and the left in terms of how he envisioned the state. Now, he dies in 1940, so he died before the establishment of the state, so he couldn't envision a lot of what was going on. And one of the things that Lustig argues in his book is one of the things he couldn't envision, Jabotinsky, was really the trauma that was produced by the Holocaust and the way in which that trauma is the engine that's driving a certain kind of Israeli mentality regarding the Arab minority.
Right, and you make a good observation about what Hannah Arendt was, trying to push back then, because which that UN, the 10-year UN guardianship would have been, because and I'm not going to say this name right. I just found out about it probably in the last few months, but Orla Sharim.
Orly Sharim, yeah.
Yeah, you know what I'm talking about, right? Okay, so about 1900, 1901. Yeah. And it was the idea being that the Orthodox Jew can't accept an Israel because it's not a divine creation. And the UN, and last I checked, the UN in Britain weren't divine.
Right.
So you basically have a secular state.
Yeah.
And it's almost like, I mean, I'm not religious. I don't have a dog in this fight, as I said earlier, but it just seems like the result we've gotten is kind of less than a divine result, because Israelis are not living in peace.
Right. That's for sure. I think all Israelis would acknowledge that. Yeah.
I got friends that have been back there, and around 2014, when when they were caught bombing Gaza, and those guys were launching, gunpowder-filled volleyballs or whatever they were doing. And Iron Dome, which ironically W would not pay for, that Obama did pay for,
right,
was protecting a lot of Israelis. I mean, I think 100 Israelis died in that skirmish, and that was like mostly soldiers.
right.
Whereas it was like 2,000, 3,000 Palestinians were murdered in Gaza. So how does the Israeli reconcile that with any sort of peace? The adult in the room would say you make deals with your enemies, or you make peace with your enemies and deals with your friends.
Right.
But we keep supporting an agenda that is completely contrary to any sort of peace negotiation whatsoever. And the Palestinians are not going to go away.
Right. Yes, no, I know that. I think that Ben-Gurion made three mistakes, and given the historical context, you can understand why he made the mistakes. His first mistake was that if you create a Jewish state, diaspora Jews will come to and live there. That didn't happen. Not in large numbers, certainly not in large numbers from the United States.
Right.
The second mistake he made was that eventually, if you create a Jewish state, the Arabs will leave. Eventually, they'll just end up migrating to other Arab countries.
Right.
The third mistake that he made was that the ultra-Orthodox people who were living in Israel would eventually secularize. So all three of those were wrong. The American Jews didn't come en masse to Israel. The Arabs didn't leave. And it's very interesting as to why he thought the Arabs would leave. And this is something that's really worth a whole other kind of show, right?
Sure.
The reason that he thought the Arabs wouldn't leave because the Zionists were not willing to acknowledge the existence of something called the Palestinian people. Mm-hmm. They just thought that these people were Arabs that happened to live in Palestine. They were subjects of the Ottoman Sultan before the British Mandate, and they didn't really have any kind of national cohesiveness. And this was a mistake that Israel made until the 70s. It's not until the late 1970s that Israel officially acknowledges the existence of a Palestinian people. So Rashid Khalidi, the Edward Said professor of Middle East Studies at Columbia University, wrote a book where he tries to argue and show that there was a national consciousness of people living in Palestine at the beginning of the 20th century. So that in a certain sense, Palestinian nationalism and Jewish nationalism, Zionism, are almost born simultaneously. But Israel had a very hard time acknowledging that existed. So Ben-Gurion thought, look, these people, why would they want to live? If you're a Muslim or Christian Arab, why would you want to live in a Jewish state? You'll go to Kuwait, or you go to Iraq, or you go to Jordan, you go to Lebanon, you go to Egypt, go to Saudi Arabia, you go where other Arabs are. But right. A lot of but the Palestinians actually did have a national consciousness, and they did.
Well, see, and to your point, this I get in arguments with conservatives all the time. Well, they listen to fucking Dennis Prager or whoever, and they're like, well, Palestine was never a government. Well, you know what? Neither was goddamn Syria or Iraq or Iran. Yeah. The Saudis were a bunch of Bedouins floating around until Standard Oil made a government out of them in the 1920s. And the Zionists had the hardest pitch. The Zionists had the hardest pitch to get Europeans to come on this plan. Because if you're a German Jew in Munich and you got a nice accounting business going on, you go to the opera, you go to the museum, you got a cool place to live, your secretary blows you on the weekends, why are you going to leave civilization, quote unquote, to go to the desert to live with a bunch of Bedouins? That was why the Zionists had such a hard time in the 20s and 30s. If the Holocaust hadn't happened, there would be no unification of the idea. Yeah, right?
I think it's even stronger than that. One of the interesting things is what's called the second immigration, or the second Aliyah, which was from about 1904, 1905 to around 1918, 1919, which is considered to be the first Zionist immigration of Jews who came as Zionists. About 50% of them moved back to Europe after between 5 and 6 years. In other words, most of the people who came went back to Europe in the 1920s. I mean, once Europe starts to destabilize in the 30s, those people that come to Palestine have no place to go back to. So they can't go back to Germany, they can't go back to Austria, they can't go back to Poland.
Right.
So at that point there was really no choice. And after the United States established the Johnson-Reed Act limiting immigration in 1924, they couldn't get into America either. So in a certain sense, for a lot of those people, the success of the immigration of the Jews to Palestine was largely the result of the destabilization of Europe at the beginning of the 1930s. And then, of course, once you get into 1939, 1940, then the Jews were trapped and they couldn't get out.
Absolutely.
So I think that you're right. And that's the kind of complicated story that, in a certain sense, the goodwill of the United Nations to vote in favor of partition, which was the establishment of a Jewish state, you can't disconnect that from the Second World War. I mean, it only happens 3 years later.
Right,
so,
absolutely.
So there is, you can't take, in a funny way, you kind of can't take the Holocaust out of the picture.
No, you can't. But to conflate atrocities, which is what we seem to keep doing, in the American media, especially, it's always like, well, the Holocaust happened, so therefore Israel. It's like, well, no, the Holocaust happened, which was an atrocity. That doesn't justify another atrocity, which is what happened. Yeah. And that's the challenge I have with American conservatives when they say, Palestine wasn't a country. Well, for 500 years, none of it was a country. You had governors and mayors and like councils here and there, and everybody. And when they were divvying up the spoils after the Ottoman Empire fell, Palestine just kept getting put to the side, and was never allowed to form a government. And there's a million theories about that, whether it's Baron Rothschild or the Balfour Agreement, having more sinister implications than what was worded. It just becomes a I won't say a racist clusterfuck, because Israel isn't exactly a completely liberal country with Ethiopian Jews either. But it just seems like there's something more afoot than what ended up happening.
Look, I think part of somebody once defined Zionism. And this really captures the irony and the tragedy of the story. Someone wants to define Zionism as a man jumping out of the third story of a burning building and landing on someone else's head. And in a certain way, this captures, in a certain sense, yes, of course, the person had to jump off the building, right, or else he was going to die. And of course, there's somebody standing on the ground that he lands on, and so in a certain sense, I think that it's how do you learn to live with that and create a healthy, equitable, just society from that scenario?
Right. Well, so in wrapping up, we got a few minutes left. So in wrapping up, obviously you're studied. You know this situation. This challenge. Moving forward. Am I being too simplistic? What are some of your ideas for a solution moving forward?
I think I'm very much in favor of what Lustig argues in his book. I think moving forward is that liberal Zionists and American Jews have to come to terms with the fact that, as you said, there's one state between the river and the sea, and that state is Israel, and there is not going to be a Palestinian state. And those Palestinians who are living between the river and the sea have to be incorporated into Israeli society, and we have to kind of try to create as equitable and just a society as we can, because there really isn't any other choice. And this, I think here's my particular, view, the longer that we, get up and chant two states, we're giving the people who are one-staters,
right,
but apartheid one-staters, we're giving them free reign to determine what the nature of that state's going to be. So I think we have to start thinking one state and start thinking about what kind of a state we want Israel to be. Like we don't live there. I'm an Israeli citizen, but I live in America. We don't live there. And so obviously Israelis are going to have to choose among themselves what kind of a state it's going to be. We certainly, I think that as American Jews, we certainly have a voice. I think anybody has a voice, and anyone has a voice to criticize any country.
Right.
But I think that's part of, for me, that's part of the next step. And I think the annexation question, which is happening now, is something that's very, very, it's very serious. And if it does take place, I think it's going to be a game changer.
And that's on July 1st, correct?
I think July 1st. I don't know exactly the date. It's sometime in July. And again, the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, as you know, is involved in a court case. So there are a lot of variables that may make annexation not really possible. Nobody knows whether it's really just a political ploy or not. But we'll see. We'll see, but it's going to be. It can be a long, hot summer.
See, and that way, and that's the thing is my biggest challenge with all of this is to the dialogue, the conversation in Israel, it's kind of like American foreign policy, right? You got the liberals saying we should bomb Syria, and then the conservative going, no, we should really, really bomb Syria. That's the level of conversation with, you know what I mean? So when I see Israelis, was it 2 years ago now, a year and a half ago? You had that really hot chick, the attorney general, ex-supermodel person.
Right.
She was running. And then you had Benny Gantz and you had Bibi. And you're going, all right, should we really fuck the Palestinians? Nah, we should just fuck the Palestinians. Oh, that guy's too liberal. You know, it's like, it's that same kind of conversation. It doesn't seem to be any more liberals in Israel. When I was there 30 years ago, I met more genuinely liberal Israelis, like not in lip service, but genuinely liberal Israelis, more so than I do talk to now, especially online.
Yeah. I think you're right. I think, Israel is going through a crisis of liberalism. I think America, to some degree, is going through its own crisis of liberalism,
yeah.
In a different way. But I think you're right. On the other hand, last Saturday night, there was this anti-annexation protest of tens of thousands of Israelis in the streets of Tel Aviv. So I think no one knows what's going to wake up what beast that's living under what rock, So right. In a certain way, right now, liberalism is in a lot of trouble in Israel. Demographically, the numbers aren't there anymore.
No.
And this has to do with the fact that most Israelis that leave Israel are the liberal Israelis.
Right. Well, I mean, after that disastrous second intifada, when Ariel Sharon went to the Dome of the Rock and pulled his shit, right. It was not successful because it lost that entire peace element that the first one had.
Yeah.
And the first one was almost like Franz Ferdinand. It was right. An Israeli troop truck ran into some Palestinian workers. It was like the snowball fight that started the Revolutionary War. It was just this accidental thing.
Right.
And then you had these amazing time life, pictures of kids throwing rocks at these big bad soldiers. And suddenly the narrative got changed,
right.
into more of a reality.
You have in Israel the phenomena of the second intifada conservatives. That is the kind of like the neoconservatives in America who were reacting against the kind of student protests of the New Left in the 60s.
Mm-hmm.
So you have the second intifada conservatives of the basically liberal Israelis who were reacting to the bus bombings of the second intifada and got pushed all the way to the right. So that phenomena certainly exists. And a lot of people who were liberal, very liberal, in the 1980s and 1990s, the 2000 Intifada really pushed them because they were living in a city where buses were blowing up all the time.
Mm-hmm.
So, it's a complicated story in terms of how that then comes around again, and can there be something else that can happen in Israel that can really evoke that kind of liberalism? Because I think a lot of Israelis, even those that are now much more right-wing, are right-wing largely out of fear.
Sure.
And I think that if there's a way in which the fear factor can be lowered, I think the liberalism will start to kind of rise up to the surface again. I mean, that's the hope, right? That's
Sure.
the only hope that we have.
Sure. Well, hey, listen, Shaul, I appreciate you coming on. This has been great. If you want to come on again, I'd love to have you on as this situation develops. Like you said, it's going to be a long, hot summer.
Yeah.
Is there any, I know you're working on a new book, aren't you? When's that coming out?
Well, I'm working on a book about a guy named Meir Kahane, who was an American kind of militant rabbi who eventually moves to Israel and has his own political career. And that's a whole other story. I'd be happy to come on and talk about him.
I would love that.
He's an important piece of the story because he's the radical militant right wing he was actually assassinated in New York in 1991, but he's kind of or 1990, but he's the kind of forefather of the radical right-wing militants in Israel today.
Wow. Okay. Well, and also a little shout out, thanks to Mike Melia for connecting us.
Yeah, Mike and I are old friends.
Yeah, good bloke. He came on last year for about an hour when I was still doing hour-long shows, and we had a great talk about the subversion of the counterculture in America. So that was a good hour.
Yeah, Michael's great.
Mike's great, man. So, well, guys, listen, my guest has been Shaul Magid, and I'm going to put some links to some of his essays and articles, and where you can get a couple of his previous books and go from there. Again, patreon.com/The Bitter Truth. If you want to support the show, you can always listen on all the usual suspects, Spotify, YouTube, iTunes, etc., etc. And as always, if this stuff makes you uncomfortable, it's supposed to. Sleep tight.